Welcome back to the podcast. I'm excited to be here today and to talk about some interesting stuff. Now, I am way out of where my normal field of play is. But be that as it may, I think it may be helpful to some of you, and especially to leaders who are leading leaders. And so leadership is an interesting concept. The word leadership is nowhere in the Bible. That is because there are leaders everywhere, and only the blind and the deaf spiritually can't see the poignant points of leadership in the Bible. And so life is a challenging deal because we want everything to be just kind of in your face. Oh, wow, it says this, that, or the other thing. The reality is that God leaves a lot of meat on the bone and wants us to discover it and wants us to understand it. And so Paul used their own poets to talk to them. And this is an attempt to do what Paul did and to talk about some things that are not just from the traditional point of context with the Bible, but showing that there are ways that the Bible interacts with all human nature. So when you study the Bible is not in the state of polishing everything or in the business of fixing up everything so that we don't have to think through it. The Bible leaves the good, bad, and the ugly in there. And it is not too concerned or bothered or worried about what people think about it. So there's another part in the scriptures that talk about leadership, and that is the way that the kings are used in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, you have church leaders. In the Old Testament, you have the nation leaders of Israel. And really, to be honest with you, probably the greatest of all of the Old Testament leaders and models of leadership would be Moses. And I think that's a fact that is indisputable for his inestimable value and imprint that he left on the world, including the nation of Israel that exists. But there's a lot of other things that happened. And there's a lot of other poets that write around this idea. And so we're going to explore over the next few episodes some leadership points and principles from things that I will probably never preach, okay? So the podcast is not just another pulpit and another microphone for me. The podcast is fun for me. It's easy. It's so relaxing for me to do this because I'm a voracious reader. I don't know a lot. I've read a lot, and everything I know, I've borrowed from somebody else, okay? But I'm extremely disciplined when I'm in the pulpit. I loathe and resent the loose cannons that just fire off. And when I'm in the pulpit, I tell Truth Church all the time, I have a 3-word job description. Preach the word. There it is. That's my job description. And so there's a lot of other things that I read, and there is a ton of stuff that I think about that I really, and I am considering authoring a few things right now, but unless I get into other venues of expression, I'm extremely limited. So this is a great deal of fun for me to come into the studio with the help of Thomas McLeod and Preston and people that help with this, and to just kind of run a stream of consciousness and talk about things that I really don't feel at liberty to talk about in the pulpit. And one of those is Homer's Iliad. And the Iliad is basically the story of the Trojan War. And the ancient Greeks believed that the Trojan War happened somewhere between the 12th and 13th century BC. and it had these great characters in it. And there was a man named Homer, and he wrote this massive poem. In case you don't believe it's massive, here is his poem. I can't even fathom writing a poem that big. A lot of people can't fathom reading a poem like that, let alone writing it. Anyhow, in the Iliad, by the time the Iliad, or the story of the Trojan War, opens up, it's been going on about 9.5 years. When you get to book 1 of Homer's Iliad, the Trojan War is 9.5 years long. Okay. And then, you know how you have a sentence and then there's kind of like this explanation. There's these parentheses. And so basically book 1 through like book 16 of Homer's massive poem is parenthetical. It's in parentheses. And what it's doing is explaining to you why the war happened, why it should or shouldn't have happened. It explains some key characters, okay? And so there's some key characters. One is Achilles, and most of you have used his name by saying your Achilles heel, or the weak spot of Achilles' life. And then, of course, you have Agamemnon, who is kind of the master of the crowd of the Greeks. And you have Helen of Troy and all of this. And you can do a very brief and cursory, examination of it, like on Wikipedia, and get basically the thumbnail sketch of it. Now, what's interesting to me is I've read Homer's Iliad, and I'm embarrassingly enough to say this, and because it earmarks me as a dork or a nerd. But I have read the Iliad multiple times. I'm not going to tell you how many times I've read it. I said I'm embarrassed, okay? But you could read it straight through as a history of war. You could read it straight through. I read it through in college one time because of the gods that are in it, the mythological Grecian gods. You have Zeus, you have, all of these gods that are involved. And so, but what I was looking for in that was an assignment. But then years later, I read it through as a kind of a master class in different things. And so what I really, really want to tease out in these next few episodes, and if I was writing a paper or a book on this, it would just be Homeric leadership, or the leadership skills or lack thereof, I might add, that Homer shows you that was in the Trojan War. So let's look at the difference between Homer and someone like Shakespeare or someone. So Shakespeare's the master of drama. Homer's the master of narration. Okay, he's not just telling you a story. He's narrating why things happen and what's happening. The other thing I could say about Homer is that the ancient Greeks really never believed in their gods. And you could take, for instance, if you're going to read the Iliad, obviously nobody believes Zeus. Even they didn't believe that Zeus was a real god. What they mean with Zeus is, and that's why in the Iliad he kind of shows up as this capricious, god that meddles and messes with everybody, right? And so what they have for him is he could be replaced by just fate or life. Life throws you curveballs. Okay, well, that's Zeus. Zeus's job in the Iliad is just to act like an idiot, and which he rallies to the challenge exceptionally well. And with exemplary skill, he rises to this challenge and masters it and is the supreme idiot. Okay, he's duplicitous. He's wanton. He's lustful. If the people down on earth want it, he wants it. And if they get it, he gets mad that they got it and he didn't get it. And so he goes over to some other god and starts making havoc because he didn't get his way on Mount Olympus or whatever. So anyhow, you have this concept of, these gods, but really it's their version of just saying fate, or it's their version of saying, life throws stuff at you. They have a god for weather. And so when the weather is against you, well, then that's this god. So don't get too carried away in what they believed about those gods, because they really didn't either. Those gods were all replacement valuations for something in life they couldn't control. And like especially love. You couldn't control love, right? So love had to be a goddess, Aphrodite. And so she was always, making the wrong person fall in love with the wrong person and causing all kinds of havoc in that. So anyhow, so that's just a little background about the storyline itself. Now, book 1 opens up with this character, which in the next episode, I'm going to explain to you this character. His name is Agamemnon. I've talked about him on the podcast before. You've got to love a dude that has a name like that. There's not a sissy bone in this guy's body. His name is Agamemnon. Like, that's so masculine to me. Anyhow, he's a jerk. He is a self-absorbed jerk. And I'm going to talk about him as a leader in the next episode, which, mind you, Andrew Bentley will be joining me. Now, Andrew Bentley has given his life to reading leadership books and applying leadership theories. But so he's going to weigh in from a secular leadership and like in the business world as I kind of unparse and unpack or parse through what these characters are doing. So basically, the war starts, and it's over a spurned lover. It's an unnecessary war. And what you got to understand about the Greeks is the Greeks were not one country, okay? They weren't an empire. And so one of the myths of the Grecians is that they were a one or a mono unit. They weren't. They were the Greek city-states. So what you have is you have all of these different little cities, and maybe they grew bigger than cities and they were small regions. And here's important. So think about this. So from Alexander the Great, Agamemnon, it doesn't matter who was ever the leader of this. What you have to understand is that leader was an elected leader, number one, and number two, he was leading kings. So the term, he was literally, this is their title, king of other kings. That's what he was. So not only was he a king, not only did he have to marshal an army, not only did he have to gather up men, but he had to lead in this massively complex organization all these little kingdoms, including his own. He was not a big shot just because he was the first or the highest ranking in the hierarchical stack rank. He was probably, and at times had a smaller kingdom than some of these other men that had larger kingdoms. So there's an army, there's a war, and there's a cause. The cause is a bit dubious, and we'll fight through that here in a minute, okay? But what he has to do is he has to get this coalition of allies together. And some of the Greeks would fight and some of them wouldn't. You had to get them to your cause. And so the whole story of the Grecian Empire and how it functioned as an empire is a brilliant case study on how to get along with people that don't really have to get along with you. They don't. They are kings in their own right. And they can say, yeah, no, we're not going to your war. Not a good enough cause, not worth dying for. So you have to be masterful at building coalitions in the Grecian Empire. Now, the greatest unit that it ever became was under Alexander the Great, who truly mastered it. When he inherited it from his father, Philip, he took it to another level. And he was so much of a consummate tactician that his strategies seemed invincible and people followed him. Agamemnon, not so much. He's struggling a bit here. And so what Agamemnon does is what you have is he gets them all to go to war because they're offended over this woman, the Helen of Troy, and so they're fighting over who gets to marry this person, and she's beautiful and whatnot. Anyhow, Agamemnon is the first among equals, king of other kings. And so what happens is you're not allowed in the Grecian empire and hierarchical rank, you're not allowed to just march down there and demand, I want this unit to do this. It wasn't an army like that. What you did was you went to the king of that unit and the king of that nation, and you said, for instance, Nestor, I want you to go and do this with your men. And Nestor would say, yeah, good plan, Agamemnon. Or he would say, thou art beside thyself in thy cups, meaning you're drunk. You've been drinking in your cups too much. And that's the craziest plan ever in the world. And he's not going to do it. So he's able to say, yeah, we're not joining this skirmish because this is a dumb plan at a dumb time by a dumb man. Okay? So then Agamemnon should or could go back and win a coalition again and say, okay, you were right. So what you have is this brilliant understanding of Homer's Iliad is the story of the Trojan War and how all these kings are generals, and you got to win them to your cause. You got to show that you're normal and you're good thinking and you're clear thinking. And so really the thing comes up in this whole story of Homer's Iliad, which is the question of emotional intelligence. Now, I've talked about this on the podcast, and I've talked about IQ as your intelligent quotient, okay? But I've also talked about your EQ, which is your emotional quotient. Now, just because someone has a high IQ does not mean they have a high EQ. They could have a brilliant mind, know many things, but don't know how to apply it. And so in that setting, their emotional quotient or intelligence becomes challenged and becomes to where it's struggling because they know a lot. They can do great things, but they don't have any relational component to it, okay? So in this regard, one has to think about, how do I get these people to work with me? How do I grow this team? How do I get these people on board? And this is extremely important, and it's important in this story and to everyone else. So the destruction of Troy is the war between the Greeks and the Trojans. That's the backdrop, okay? One writer says, given the wide array of topics available, the Iliad's selection of the narrowest sliver of the great and most least consequential period of this all-encompassing war, okay, an equal between a quarrel between a warrior and his commander during the protracted stalemate of the siege is rather stunning, okay? Alexander writes in his book, The War That Killed Achilles, he said that really this argument that is between Agamemnon and Achilles is like the narrowest part of the whole story. And so what you have to think of is Homer is showing you, oh man, all these other guys are going to write about the war. And most historians do. And most historians write about, like for instance, the two greatest historians in the world, right? Herodotus and Edward Gibbon, which my preference is Edward Gibbon, who wrote of the fall and decline of the Roman Empire. Fascinating man. A lot of people argue whether or not he was spot on, but his brilliant observations of the Caesars is just priceless. Okay, so they are people who are going to write history as in the sense of chronological order. Okay, so what you have is Homer, who says, yeah, that's the war. Great. That's who shot who. And yeah, you ran all these people against the wall. But have you considered all the stories about leadership? And have you asked yourself true questions about the epic, right? So you think about Achilles is the hero, the Iliad's hero, although he's not very much a hero in the first 16 books of the poem. He's kind of a whiny baby, but we'll get to that in the next episode with Andrew. But Achilles dies in an unnecessary war, and he finds no meaning in it. And the question begs to be asked, why? Right? Achilles is the hero in which his speeches give the poem its powerful meaning. Achilles rages against his commander Agamemnon. From the very beginning, these two are chewing each other's face off, okay? And it is the quarrel between Agamemnon, which I'll get to in the next episode. He does something so unbelievably self-centered that it's mind-boggling, right? That someone can be that way. And so what he does is he does this, and then he comes back around and says, yeah, whatever, it's what I want, and I get what I want, okay? So that's an important part. The other thing that you have to think about is the power of speech in Homeric leadership, or Homer's Iliad. The power of speech is so strong. So like anywhere else you're thinking about it, you think about war and you're like, yep, this guy shot at this guy. Got it. There's the war. But what's brilliant about Homer is he doesn't just say the shot was fired, the platoon moved in, the battalion crossed over. What he did is he unpacked bit by bit the speeches. So you get right from the beginning, you get a true sense that speech really matters. So if you're looking at this, Homeric leadership begs you to emphasize, almost to the point to where Homer exaggerates the power of communication, right? So if you read, like, for instance, Herodotus and those historians, they find great momentum and great urgency and uplifting in the mechanisms of battle. Homer doesn't. Homer's just like, here's the men, right? The men are so real, raw, leaders that say stupid things, leaders that inflame people, leaders that make mistakes and then back up and say, yeah, I probably shouldn't have said that or did that. And so you really get a sense of how important communication is in leadership. And so in the next multiple episodes, we'll unpack all of that. And you need to see how little petty things grow, right? So this little tiny infraction that Agamemnon makes and will not say he's sorry. He does not know how to apologize, right? Because he cannot recant his position. He's on the moral high ground, so he supposes. And everyone sees that he's not, and he will not communicate, and so he loses the potential to lead Achilles, which is the Argives, or the Grecian hero of war. And so it's amazing how this plays out, how important it is for you to realize as a leader that communication really, really does matter. And so when you get into studying it out and you get into looking at emotional intelligence, you see the beauty of what it is for someone to be self-aware, self-regulating, socially aware, and relationally managed. Okay, so if you were to break down emotional intelligence, it would comprise the definition and the idea of it would be comprised of those 4 ideas: self-aware. You understand who you are, what you're doing, what others think of you, and then you're aware of your own emotions, and you regulate those emotions. You're self-regulating or self-disciplining. Now, then the third part of an emotional intelligence is that you're socially aware. You're not only aware inwardly, you're aware outwardly, right? So this is what I think, but this is probably what they think. You're able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and consider your behaviors or your actions. And then the final component is you are socially disciplined and managing emotions, not only of yourself, but of others around you. And so there's a great deal of discussion that can happen around that. So I'm excited to talk in the next few weeks, and it may be to where we need to add some episodes to it, but we'll get around to it, and it'll be effective and good. And you know why it's fun to do this? Because I'm not doing this in my pulpit. I'm never going to go to my pulpit and take a text on Homer and start down all of this. So the podcast is greatly fun, and it's so different than anything else that we get to do, and we're excited to talk about it. So join us here momentarily, and consider just thinking about leadership in that context. Thank you.